presentation, I'm somewhat infamous for my exuberance, for lack of a better word, when I'm presenting. And so I usually get the worst slot at any given conference because they put me in the early morning slot because they want me to wake people up in the morning, or they put me immediately after lunch because they want me to wake people up after lunch. And for my, personally, I'm always a little bit insulted by this. And so imagine my relief when an a.m. talking slot. And it was only after I'd been in Brazil for a day or two where I realized, wait a minute, the 11 a.m. slot is the early morning slot. I've been given the early morning slot again. So thank you very much for making it out so early in the morning here, 11 a.m. Here. I'm here to talk about corporate open source anti-patents, how to do it wrong. Speaking personally, I kind of took me a couple years of my career to realize that I don't actually learn anything from success. And if I did, my life would probably be a lot happier, but I seem to only be able to learn things from failure. And I think this is true of a lot of people. I think we really only learn most viscerally from failure. So I'm here to talk about failure and how to fail from a corporation that is trying to open source software. So before I get into failure, though, I want to go into a little bit of history. Because we treat open source as if it's a novel phenomenon, but actually in the beginning there was nothing but source code. And I was visiting with a friend of mine, a guy named Tom Hill, who was at EDS from the beginning. And Tom is one of these guys that has got a story about everything in computing. And he and I were talking about open source, and he whipped out this little black book that he has clearly had since like the 50s. And he opened it up to a page. He said, you see this page? This was February 17th, 1983. And I was having a meeting with IBM. And IBM was telling me that they were transitioning from a source model to what they called their all-object model. They were going to ship binaries instead of shipping the source code. And they said, I wrote it down in my little black book because I knew at that moment the industry was changing. And it was. And in 1983 and before, 6th edition Unix, the source code was available for everybody. But by 7th edition in 1979, AT&T had pulled back and the source code was no longer available. So in the late 70s, early 80s, we moved to this kind of proprietary model, and we saw a boom in proprietary software that was led by the PC revolution. And Microsoft became very much the spiritual leader of proprietary software. And indeed, I actually think that part of the reason that Microsoft stumbles today is because they've never been able to get out from underneath the lack of trust that they instilled in us with this proprietary model. And this was from the very beginning. Bill Gates said in the very early days when Microsoft was based in Albuquerque, Bill Gates sent a very nasty note to people who were sharing his Altair Basic with physical tapes about how they were pirates and so on. And Microsoft led this proprietary model. And throughout the 90s, we saw proprietary software blossom. Blossom, maybe metastasize is a better word there, better than blossom. And what we saw relative to open source is that the open source became attractive primarily because proprietary software has got some really nasty side effects. And first among these is vendor lock-in. When you buy proprietary software, your software vendor has a natural monopoly over you. And bad monopolists will act in very bad ways, and they'll lock you into a product. And again, Microsoft was kind of the Naples Ultra example of this. Oracle is another, there are many. And open source became very attractive to get out of vendor lock-in. We need to end this idea of your vendor being able to hand you a price increase. And so open source started with the infrastructure software. It started with the software that we wanted to be least locked into. It started with the languages and the runtimes. It started with the operating systems, with databases, and with web servers. And it began to percolate, of course, up the stack. So what happened in the 2000s? Well, in the 2000s, it was becoming increasingly acceptable to use open source. And then the economy imploded. And we talk about kind of the Great Recession of 2008. For those of us in high tech, the Great Recession of 2008 doesn't hold a candle to the nuclear winter that was 2001, 2002, when our industry was decimated. Budgets were destroyed, and open source became not something that was just something that people would consider. It became something that people had to adopt in order to be able to build reasonable businesses. The businesses that blossomed in the 2000s could not have succeeded without open source. Google, Facebook, Amazon, these companies would not have succeeded without open source. Open source changed their cost model fundamentally. And in the early 2000s, the rhetoric from some of these companies became somewhat insufferable. Google was much more of a user of open source than they were a contributor to open source. And they would talk about how great open source was, but of course it was great for them. Google has since become a much better corporate citizen. Other companies like Amazon have not. But what we saw in the early 2000s was a very feverish use of open source by corporations, but primarily as a way of saving money, not a contribution to open source. Now, there were counterexamples, and the counterexamples that are most stark were those of us who were trying to compete in infrastructure software, and in particular, from my experience, operating systems. So I worked at Sun for 14 years, and I worked in the Solaris kernel development group. And in Solaris, obviously, an operating system, the definition of what was economically acceptable for an operating system changed in the 2000s. And in order to be viable as an operating system, you had to be open source. That was a requirement. And every other proprietary Unix vendor simply accepted the fact that they were going to fade into irrelevance, that they were going to still be proprietary, still be expensive, and were simply going to become less relevant. At Sun, we fervently believed in Unix, and we refused to lie down and accept that fate. So we did something extremely challenging. We open sourced the operating system. And this is challenging because leaping the chasm from proprietary software to open source software requires dealing with a whole bunch of messy issues. In particular, you've got to deal with a lot of legal issues. When you build this proprietary software, certainly when we built Solaris, we weren't thinking about what we needed to do to open source it. That wasn't conceived of in the early 90s. In the late 90s, early 2000s, when we wanted to go open source it, we had to deal with, I think we had at one point, 400 covenants or contracts that covered various elements of the source code, and we had to go renegotiate every single one of those. It was a huge, massive undertaking. It required an enormous amount of dedication, but we did it. And Sun open sourced Solaris as open Solaris. How many of you heard of open Solaris? Okay, good. And open Solaris came out under what's called a weak copyleft license, the CDDL, the Community Development Distribution License. And it started, this was in 2005, and it actually started with a technology that I had developed along with two colleagues, dtrace. So dtrace is a facility that for the dynamic instrumentation of production systems that we had added to Solaris in 2003, and it was a source of great pride for me that this was the first bit of technology we open sourced. And we open sourced dtrace first, because we had not yet secured the agreements we needed to be able to open source the whole system. But we wanted to open source a nugget that showed that we were serious about this, that we were going to open source not the periphery, but the core of the system, the differentiators, the innovation. And so we did that with dtrace. And again, it was a source of great pride to me that technology that I had developed with my colleagues was going to become the tip of this particular spear. We open sourced the rest of the operating system later that year, in June 2005, and Open Solaris was born. And from then, that point forward, all development on Solaris was in the open. It was Open Solaris. And it was terrific. I think that there are very few examples of software that is as big, as important as Solaris is, that leapt the chasm from proprietary to open. It's very hard to think of them. And Sun did a lot of things right when we did this. I mean, we open sourced it, and that was the first thing we did right. So that was great. But this talk isn't really what we did right, about what we did right. we also did lots of things wrong. And by the time Oracle bought Sun in 2010, the Open Solaris was, for a lot of reasons, adrift. And there was a community, but they kind of felt alienated and confused, and the Sun itself obviously was being consumed by this, well, I would say evil empire, but Oracle is really not evil. We'll talk about Oracle in a second. And so there was kind of a lot of confusion. I would say it was out there, but we'd done a lot of things wrong. After the Oracle acquisition, it became very apparent, rapidly apparent, that Oracle did not care at all about open source and about Open Solaris. Now, you might think, oh, did Oracle wanted to kill Open Solaris? Oracle's evil. Oracle's not evil. And the reason Oracle's not evil is because evil requires humanity. Machines aren't evil. It's just a machine. And if you have a corporation that is a sociopath, which is what Oracle is, I don't think it's evil. I think it's just a machine. The key is that you want to think of Oracle the way you think of a lawnmower. But a lawnmower is not evil. It's just a lawnmower. It mows the lawn. And if you stick your hand in the lawnmower's going to cut it off. You're not going to have a hand anymore. And you say, oh, the lawnmower hates me. No, the lawnmower doesn't hate you. The lawnmower is simply a lawnmower and you stuck your hand in it. So this is the important thing about Oracle. That Oracle emphatically does not care. Oracle can't care. Oracle does not have the neural connections to care. And this is what, it took me a while to kind of figure this out. And the reason it took me a while to figure this out, by the way, is I just assumed that the stereotypes of Oracle were false, right? Stereotypes are always false. That's why they're stereotypes. But the thing about Oracle is that every stereotype about Oracle is even truer than that stereotype would lead you to believe. Everything you think about Oracle is truer than you think it is. It's an amazing entity, Oracle. Very, very simple, really. It is a lawnmower. Lawnmower, not complicated, a lawnmower. So Oracle became very clear that Oracle had zero interest, and could not have interest in the open source community or in open source. And indeed, there was even a movement afoot inside of Oracle to close the operating system that we had worked so hard to open up. And that I have to say is like, that's not going to happen. Because, that just seems like it's too deliberate an act for the lawnmower. But as it turns out, I underestimated Oracle in this instance. And Oracle actually did close the operating system. And if Solaris was the largest, most complicated piece of software to leap the chasm from proprietary to open, it is certainly the only body of software that I know that went from proprietary to open and then went back. And so this is a memo that was sent by the putative Solaris leadership at the time. This has never been publicly announced. Oracle to this day has not publicly announced what they've done with Open Solaris, because to publicly announce it would show too much empathy with humanity. So Oracle has not publicly announced it, but this is what was sent out internally and ultimately leaked, is that they were effectively stopping the open source effort, and it was no longer going to be open source. This, frankly, is a depraved act. It is one that I as a former, at this point in time, I quit Oracle. I mean, this is my one regret is I've already quit Oracle at this point, so I couldn't actually quit over this. I had actually quit. I mean, there were so many things to quit over. I quit 5 months after the acquisition. So I couldn't actually quit over this, but it was an act that I think was it was embarrassing for open source. I think it tears at a social contract. It was disgusting, frankly. It was absolutely disgusting move by Oracle to actually close an open system. And of course, it was a terrible, terrible business move as well. It greatly alienated the community, which consisted not just of the people that contributed to Open Solaris, but of course the people that were using Solaris and were buying Sun gear from Sun. So to alienate them was actually a huge mistake, and a huge business mistake. Don't fool yourself into thinking that Oracle knows how to run a business. They don't. They know how to run a monopoly. That's it. And so Oracle made a huge mistake here. And in particular, if you can imagine, if you are a Solaris engineer, as I was, to go from a proprietary system to one that was open, there's no way you're going back. And what I told Oracle's management when they were contemplating this is that if you close the system, if you close this system that we have endeavored so hard to open, you will lose the core of the ZFS team, in particular, in 90 days. That was my prediction. In 90 days, the core of the ZFS team, which at that moment was still at Oracle, will walk. And as it turns out, I was wrong. It wasn't 90, it was 45. 45 days later, 45 days after doing this, the core of the ZFS team no longer had left Oracle. The entire dtrace team left Oracle. The core of the zones team left Oracle. Networking team left Oracle. Huge Solaris diaspora out of Oracle. Engineers that had been willing to endeavor to work with Oracle and to try to make Oracle a better company, to try to bring Oracle towards the ethos of Sun with perhaps some business acumen that could keep it in business. But no. So those engineers left. And this is a huge loss to Oracle and to Solaris, but it was a huge gain to open source because the source, of course, was still out there, was no longer being developed by Oracle, but was still out there. And the kind of the great news is that from the ashes of Open Solaris and Solaris rose a new community, Illumos. And this was work that started in August 2010 when the writing was on the wall that Oracle had no interest in Open Solaris. And essentially all of the Solaris diaspora has landed in Illumos. The core of the ZFS team works on Illumos. The core of the dtrace team works on Illumos. The core of the zones team works on Illumos. And we have continued to innovate in Illumos. And I can say this with confidence because we now have 2 years of hindsight. This happened 2 years ago. And in the last 2 years, we have seen a terrific amount of fundamental innovation in these fundamental OS technologies like DNS, like dtrace, like zones, like network virtualization. And actually, the beautiful thing I have to say about this is that in Illumos, contributors hold copyright. So, for the work that Joyent has done, Joyent holds copyright. To the work that Delphix has done, Delphix holds copyright. To the work that Nexenta has done, Nexenta holds copyright. And this is under the CDDL. CDDL is a weak copyleft, a file-based copyleft. And what that means is that Oracle cannot actually take these innovations in Illumos back into Solaris because they would be violating their own license. There is some beautiful poetic justice in there. So don't look for the innovations that have happened in Illumos. Don't look for them in Solaris. They're not going to be there. They're in Illumos. They're now open source. And we've got multiple distributions like OmniOS, SmartOS, Illumian. There are others. We've got a healthy community, a vibrant community. So this has really been terrific. I mean, this whole thing has got a great ending in that we are, I think, more alive than ever before. And I encourage you to go to lumos.org or smartos.org, or if you Google ForkYAL Illumos, you will get my presentation that I gave last year on kind of the history of this. Actually, it's funny. I obviously I don't hold back on my opinions on Oracle, and I gave that talk at LISA last year in the U.S. And Oracle was actually a sponsor of that conference. And people came up to me afterwards and they said, aren't you kind of worried for your personal safety here? I'm like, oh, the lawnmower does not care. I'm not worried about it. You can make fun of the lawnmower all you want. Like the lawnmower just doesn't give it. But what was interesting was when the videos for this conference began to come up online, and all of the videos were online except for mine. The video wasn't there. And I'm just like, I don't know, things take longer, then I don't know what's going on. But some of my colleagues were like, no, wait a minute. This is like, there's a conspiracy here. Oracle was preventing this somehow. I'm like, no, I think it's Oracle that's preventing this. And so, kind of a week passes, and I'm like, okay, now this is a little weird. I mean, and now every other video is available except for mine. Mine hasn't been available for a week. And finally, my video appears. And you start watching the video, and there's this huge disclaimer. The following opinions do not represent the opinions of Usenix. Well, okay. Big disclaimer has never existed ever on any other Usenix video. Okay. All right. Then we go into the video, and in the video you have the presentation, and there's a little black strip, and you got the speaker, me. I'm talking down here, and you got the slides. Okay. And what they actually did is they took the disclaimer and reformatted it and stuck it above my head. So while I'm talking, there's a disclaimer above my head the entire time I'm talking that my opinions do not represent the opinions of the Usenix Association. And I was thinking that like when I really start to go into Oracle, I was thinking it should start to like flash, or like arrows should start to point to it, or maybe like subtitles like "He's lying. We don't. Please sponsor our conference next year. Please. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I know he's a rogue actor. We'll never have him back." And of course, it was not Oracle that actually gave a damn about this. It was Usenix that was very concerned about getting their conference sponsored again. But anyway, so you can go. This video, I'm now pleased to report, has been viewed more than all other Usenix videos combined. Anyway, so if you Google ForkYal Lumos, you'll get that video and some very candid opinions about Oracle. But those opinions, I really need to point out, those opinions are not the opinions of the Usenix Association. I actually think the next time we do a talk at Usenix, I think I'm going to start it with the following is the official position of the Usenix Association. To see if I can I get them to actually like bleep me out? Can I get them to actually, anyway. So can we learn from open source? Can we learn from the mistakes of open source? Because we did a lot of things wrong. We did the big thing that we did right was we got the source code out there. And we got the source code out there under a license that has allowed us to improve the operating system since then. But we did a lot of things wrong in the way that we went about open sourcing it, in the way that we actually engaged with the community. Let me start off with the kind of the most important thing that we screwed up. And ultimately got this right, but this kind of happened internally. The first anti-pattern I would describe is inverted thinking about your motivations for open source. So, if you work for a company, how many of you work for a company that has proprietary software somewhere? May actually be very few of you. Okay, actually more hands than I ever thought. Good. Okay, so you've got some proprietary software, and there's a discussion about should we open source this? And the most fundamental anti-pattern that certainly we exhibited at Sun, but ultimately we're able to write it, is a kind of inverted thinking about what that means to open source it. And the inverted thinking is that what is this going to buy me? Why am I doing this? Why am I giving away my software? And that's the wrong way to think about it. Because the right way to think about it is, what does this cost me? What does it cost me to open source my system? Because software has this magical property that the cost of manufacturing it is zero. Once you actually build it, the cost of making a new copy is nothing. So the cost of giving someone a copy over the internet, where they can download it from GitHub or what have you, especially because they're downloading it from GitHub or SourceForge, to you it's literally zero. It costs you nothing. Now, what it could cost you is a customer that was buying your proprietary software, and now that it's available for free, that, oh, it's open source, I'm going to go use the open source variant. Right? That's the concern. That's the canonical concern. So that's what you need to zero in on. Don't ignore the what is this going to buy me. Because once open source is out there, the gains economically are, in my experience, I think in the experience of others, secondary and tertiary. Okay, so you really want to frame this again as what does this cost me? Software has got no marginal cost. So the only cost is going to be from somebody who would have paid you but won't. Okay? And that leads us into the second anti-pattern, which is wishful thinking. And the wishful thinking is that the people that are going to take your source and run it themselves, oh, they were going to buy my software. No, they weren't. Somebody that is going to download your software, build it, and run it themselves. They're going to operationalize it. They're going to support it themselves. They're not going to turn to you for anything. They're going to take your software and they're going to do what they're going to do with it and never talk to you again. They're never going to give you any secondary or tertiary benefits. That person wasn't going to give you any money anyway. This is a very important point that is probably more intuitive here in Brazil than it is in the US. Because you know, for those of you who are making purchasing decisions, you know when you're deploying a database that's an open source database, you know that you're not actually considering buying anyone's database. The question is, which open source database do you use, or do I write my own? That's the question. Because you're not actually going to buy Oracle. That's actually not in the offer. So this is very important for a company to internalize. And it's hard to internalize that these folks aren't going to give you any money anyway. But once you realize that, and once you realize too that your existing customers, I think the other concern is that my existing customers are all going to stop paying me, and they're going to start using the open source variant. Well, not if you're not an asshole. I mean, if you're an asshole, that might be the case. But if you're not, if you provide value when you sell that software, if you provide great support, if you provide a great roadmap, customers want that are the ones that are paying. So in general, open source is not the threat to your business that you think it is. And once you internalize the fact that it's not going to cost you anything, in general, there are exceptions to this, but in general, it's not going to cost you anything, then you can really focus on what could this buy us? And this could buy you lots of things. There are, for most software, there's simply marginal gain to be running it in more places. You get, people are giving your software exposure that you're not giving it. And you're going to get bug fixes from that. You're going to get pull requests from that person, those people. And you're just going to get your software into more places. You're going to get bug fixes, maybe support of an esoteric platform or two. So you're going to, the community is going to do things that you wouldn't otherwise do. I mean, talking to the VLC guys, VLC is supported on OS2, for example. We can be pretty sure that would not be the case if it were proprietary software. Clearly, supporting OS2 is not an economic proposition, but there's just some dude out there that's got OS2 and cares very much about VLC and makes sure that it works. And that's great, that's the power of open source. For most bodies of software, there are also some nonlinear network effects by having simply more surface area out there, especially if you have an API. You've got more folks using your API. Please be nice. You've got more folks using your software and so on. So there are lots of secondary and tertiary gains, which folks I know here know. So those are anti-patterns that we did not suffer from. Here's the anti-pattern, unfortunately, even Sun, in all of its incompetence, and our incompetence could be extreme at times, in all of its incompetence, Sun never suffered from this problem, thank God. Well, not quite, actually. I guess we did. Okay, let's. So, this is one that even Sun did not suffer from, which is to say, not presenting the source code at all. And this seems obvious. I mean, why would you open source something without the source code? You obviously need the source code, but an amazing number of companies keep doing this. Do not announce any open source without the source code. The announcement for open sourcing something is very, very simple. It is a pointer to a repository. That's it. End of announcement. It's the shortest press release ever. It's a URL that has a pointer to a GitHub or what have you repository. In there, of course, there's the license and everything else. That's what an open source announcement is. And we see that HP did this most recently. HP made this huge, loud announcement about their intent to open source WebOS in December of 2011, last year. Which, of course, didn't happen. And the reason you don't announce your intent, by the way, is because you don't know how arduous the path is going to be. And in particular, there may well, in fact there probably are, legal covenants covering WebOS that prevent them from open sourcing it completely. That they are only discovering now if they actually bother to follow through on their announcement, which they may not have. The team, by the way, has since quit. So, you know, what's the point? But, so this particular mistake, open sourcing without the source code, is so unbelievably stupid that only a manager can make this decision. This is clearly a non-technical decision. And you know, I mean, if we had the HP engineers, the WebOS engineers in the room right now, they would just be like, oh, I told them so many times you can't do this without this. I mean, we know that the engineers are right thinking here, but the management isn't always. Don't do this, you gain nothing, and you lose credibility, perhaps forever. So this next one is really important, and it's a little more subtle. And this is one that we absolutely, emphatically did suffer from, which is what I call forkophobia. So when you've got a big, complicated, proprietary piece of software, one of the profound fears is that the community will take the software and run off in some other direction that you don't like. You're going to lose control of it at some level. You're concerned of a fork. We're going to have two forks, and now there's going to be two things that look similar, but they're different, and they're at war with one another. And oh God, we can't have a fork. We're terrified of a fork. And I can tell you, Open Solaris was terrified of a fork. When you are forkophobic, you collide with what I call the forking paradox. And the forking paradox is that the easier it is to fork the software, the easier it is to technically fork, the more difficult it is to actually fork the community. And this is, I think, a total paradox. It's kind of, this is, I think, somewhat an amazing result, and it's a result that we see certainly from Linux, where Linux is forkophilic, not forkophobic. And what you have when you allow people to easily fork, you allow people to experiment with ideas meaningfully. They can experiment with ideas in a downstream repo. My repo is, my software is exactly like your software, but it's got this additional feature that I've added here. Now you can call that a fork, but to me that's not a fork. This is a downstream child. I'm keeping myself in sync, and I'm making this available to people to play around with. And if this idea has legs, we can get it integrated upstream. So this allows a kind of democracy of ideas when you actually, when you allow forks to happen. If you don't allow forks to happen, if you say, you know what, forks may not happen, then you run into a really nasty problem that I call the governance orgy. So forkophobia is so destructive as an anti-pattern that it actually has its own little anti-patterns. Once you are forkophobic, the anti-pattern you run into next is that you are so terrified of forking, and it's technically impossible to fork, or difficult to fork, as it was with Open Solaris. Open Solaris was basically technically impossible to fork. That now everyone has to agree. And as soon as everyone has to agree, hey, you know what? It's governance time. And now, guess what? We don't actually agree, right? We know people don't agree on everything all the time, of course. So we need to have a system of governance that we can determine what rough consensus is. And so we need constitutions. We need elections. In the Open Solaris community, we were actually experimenting with things like ranked choice elections. It's like experimental democracy. It's like, what the hell are we doing? Are we an innovative body of software, or are we an innovative body of democracy? Because software fundamentally is not democratic, right? We don't actually take a vote on whether we think that this bug fix should go back or not. It's like, well, you know, it didn't pass, so we're not going to take back this bug. No. The beautiful thing of software is that it's right or wrong. We actually don't need to have a democracy. And when you have these elections and constitutions and constitutional conventions and all this other just BS, you have two very corrosive side effects. Whenever you have an election, you have two things that you can't avoid, and that once you have them, you can't get rid of them. One is politics, and the other is losers. People lose elections. Someone wins an election, someone loses an election. And how does it feel to be a person who lost an election? Does that feel inclusive? Does that make you feel excited about a body of software? No, that makes you feel like, hey, you know what? I'm going to go actually start up my own effort. You guys can get bent. Right, so you've taken somebody who was right in the core of the project, who wanted to contribute to the leadership, and instead of grooming that person so that they could lead the project, help lead the project, you basically told them to get lost. In fact, the community told them to get lost. The community actually took a vote and told them to get lost. They actually put it to a vote. It was actually a popularity contest. You know, it's like, you know what, you stink, get out of here. This is really, really marginalizing, and it was deeply marginalizing in Open Solaris. Open Solaris had all this problem. Huge, fantastic Roman governance orgy in Open Solaris. It was a huge problem. Now, if corporations are not forkophobic, if they are willing to encourage forking, they are much less likely to engage in a governance orgy. Now, worse than kind of experimental democracy is fake democracy. So when a corporate entity is contemplating open source, it's much easier to kind of conceive of this governance body than it is to actually listen to it. So one of the things we definitely screwed up at Open Solaris is we created this democracy But then as it turns out, it was a farce, and it was just ignored. And when an issue actually did come up on which there was actual substantive disagreement, and the community wanted to go one way, and the company wanted to go another, the company simply overruled the community. And, that's kind of inevitable. The company didn't do it because, the Sun didn't do it because they were jerks necessarily. They did it because they didn't actually intend to abide by this democracy. So democracy is not an invocation of open source, and no corporate entity should feel that they need to be democratic. Indeed, another anti-pattern, I would say, is eschewing leadership. It is not being a leader of a project. So good open source projects have good leadership. And what does good leadership mean? Good leadership means, what do you do when there's not consensus? When there's consensus, we know what to do. But when there's not consensus, you need a good leader to come in and lead the way. Now, when there's not consensus, there's going to be dissent and disagreement, and it's important. A good leader will make the dissenters feel included in the decision. So this is we talk about the BDFL model, the Benevolent Dictator for Life model. The BDFL model is just good leadership. And executing good leadership is the B, the benevolent and benevolent dictator for life. And corporations shouldn't feel like they can't lead a project that they created. Of course they can. They should lead the project. But in order to do that, and this is a challenge for every corporation, they need to give visibility to the true leaders of the project, which is not the corporate entity. It is the engineers that conceived of the project, the innovators, the creators. They are the leaders of the project. And it's very hard for a company to do this. But in order to open source, a corporation needs to give visibility. They need to uplift those leaders, and they need to become leaders of these new communities. And OpenSource did a mixed job. I think they did an acceptable job of this. A lot of companies don't, or don't understand this. And the reason they don't understand this is because to understand that you need to uplift the individual innovators, the individual leaders, and make them the leaders of these new communities, you have to internalize the fact that organizations are not actually innovative. People love to talk about, we have an innovative organization. No, you don't. You have innovative people. People innovate. Organizations do not. And to understand this is very challenging for a corporation. So another kind of anti-pattern that we see is, in addition to showing leadership, we're showing ownership. Well, we don't want to own this anymore, we're going to give it to a foundation. The Apache Foundation is becoming like the foundation for wayward software at this point. The Apache Foundation is kind of a particularly attractive target, but there are others, the Eclipse Foundation and so on. And corporations love to do this. Oh, we're going to create the foundation and we're going to put it over here. This is a mistake to give software to a foundation. Why is it a mistake? First of all, it says that the software is worth nothing, even though that's actually technically not the case. Secondly, it sends the message quite clearly that we, the corporate entity, by the way, we've got no interest in it. This is a couch that I'm leaving on the street with a sign on it that says free. And that's my gift to you. There it is, free couch. Technically, it does have bed bugs, but it's free. There you go. Who the hell picks up a free couch? Okay, I might pick up a free couch. That's a bad example. In fact, I think several more couches are free. But it sends the message that it's not actually valuable. And in the US, foundations are not simple. A foundation, in order for it to be tax exempt, it actually needs to be independent. Corporations have kind of this idea of like, oh, I will create a nonprofit and they will manage this source, but I'll kind of be in charge. Yeah, the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, doesn't actually like that. They don't let you do that. The IRS mandates, and I'm sure this is true in other countries as well, that foundation must be in charge, they must be independent, and they must own the software. So one is actually required by law to give up leadership when you give up ownership in the US. Another kind of common anti-pattern is competitive paranoia. Maybe this is the most common anti-pattern. And that is, if I put my source code out there, my competitors are all going to pounce on it and steal it. And this is I understand this thinking. I was right there. When we open sourced dtrace, we were actually thinking it's like, so do you think that this is just going to show up everywhere tomorrow, or what's going to happen? Where is dtrace going to show up first? And where dtrace showed up first? The first platform to port dtrace was not a company, absolutely blindsided by it. Apple. dtrace is on your MacBook, it's on everyone's MacBook. And absolutely not expecting that Apple was going to be the first company to port dtrace to their operating system. Why? Because Apple was not a competitor of Sun's. Your competitor, here's a newsflash, your competitor thinks you're a jackass. Your competitor would not take the time of day if you gave it to them. It's like, oh yeah, sure, he thinks it's 220. He always thinks it's 220. He's an idiot. But by the way, the reason that your competitor thinks that you're a jackass is because they're a jackass. Of course they think you're a jackass. Every jackass thinks you're a jackass. So, and by the way, if you don't believe this, then you should go work for your competitor. So, you can always kind of make that true, right? So it always has to be a jackass. And actually, paradoxically, this is actually stunning to me, what we call the not invented here syndrome in Silicon Valley, NIH. NIH is much stronger than the will to survive. Your competitor will die before they take your software. Literally. Just like the Norse in Greenland, right? The Norse in Greenland died, they went extinct because they refused to eat fish. They believed it was heathen to eat fish. They would only eat livestock, which doesn't grow very well in Greenland. There's not much grass, actually does now, but that did then. And so they couldn't have livestock, and they literally died not eating fish. So people, which is a kind of NIH, and so your competitor will go out of business. Stop worrying about your competitor. The companies that actually adopt the technology are not your competitors. All right, so this anti-pattern may be a bit controversial, but this is actually an important one, because I think that now, many years after we've done this, where we've seen dtrace and ZFS and these other technologies go where they've gone, I would say that one of the most profound anti-patterns that we see out there is anti-collaborative licensing. And in particular, the strong copyleft. So the strong copyleft dictates that every derived work from this license must also be under a strong copyleft. And we can have an argument, and I'm sure we will, about the role that had in the rise of open source. But I'm here to tell you, and I know this will be controversial, but I'm here to tell you that the strong copyleft has outlived its usefulness, whatever that usefulness was. And it was an interesting experiment. I think it was important and arguably critical, but it has outlived its usefulness because the strong copyleft does exclude competitors. It also excludes collaborators. And in particular, what we see today, the facts on the ground, are that copyleft licenses, strong copyleft licenses, are most at war with other open source code bases. This is not what we intended. The idea that GPL software cannot integrate another body of software because it's under a different open source license, I'm sorry, that is not what we intended. Not what we largely intended. And in particular, the GPL-v2 has prevented the integration of dtrace and ZFS into Linux. These are technologies that if you use Linux, you need these technologies, trust me. But it has prevented the integration of these technologies into Linux, and that is a shame. That is a shame. And it's important that we not see that again. It's important that this example will probably have to live in perpetuity. But it's important that we not see it with other bodies of software. By the way, I would just like to say, as a personal opinion, I believe that it's kind of a boogeyman that's preventing the integration of dtrace and ZFS into Linux. I think you actually could do it and not violate the GPL, but that's my opinion. And we can talk about that later. But I think the question people have to ask themselves is, was it the intent of those who license their work with GPL-v2 that they would erect walls within open source? And I think that the answer to that is no. And by the way, I'm not the only one who thinks this. I may be the only one who's telling you this bluntly, but I'm not the only one who thinks this. The GPL-v2 is in decline. And it is in decline for this reason. Here's data that was gathered by Black Duck. You can't really see the axes. You can get from 2008 to 2012. And you can see the GPL-v2 as that red line simply declining. Since this, the actual decline has accelerated. They actually thought it was going to be up there. It's more towards where my finger is now at 36.32%. The decline actually looks even more stark if you look at the actual top projects on GitHub. These are the most watched projects on GitHub. GPL is that little green sliver. That's GPL. It's one project. What is that one project? Linux. That's it. That's it. There's one HGPL project. Anyone know the HGPL project? Diaspora is under the HGPL. There are a couple in the public domain. There are a couple that are MIT GPL dual, jQuery in particular. Everything else is MIT BSD Apache. And indeed, we are actually seeing things relicense themselves. Meteor.js came out as GPL-v2 and relicensed itself MIT. Because broadly, we in open source have come to the conclusion that the danger of strong copyleft is not proprietary software running off of our software. It is erecting barriers within open source software itself. It's very important that we select collaborative licenses, and I would say, I would encourage everyone to look hard at the MPLv2. They've done a great job on the Mozilla public license. It's GPL v3 compatible, it's a weak copyleft, it's a terrific, terrific license. One other anti-pattern, and then I'll wrap up here and open it up for questions. There is a model out there, a dual license model, where you put your software under a strong copyleft and a proprietary model, and then you sell the proprietary model to anyone who's terrified of the strong copyleft model. This is the MySQL model. And Oracle, of course, has been very good about ginning up the fear on the strong copyleft model to sell more of the proprietary. This is a huge anti-pattern. Don't do this. This is a wrong way to monetize your software. Don't monetize it with a license. It just encourages too much bad behavior. And then that leads us into what I think is my final anti-pattern, demanding copyright assignment. You need to be very careful about copyright assignment. If you have an open source project, you may demand that collaborators sign over their copyright to you. You can do that. A lot of projects do. Other projects don't. Linux famously doesn't. Illumos does not. Many projects do not force you to sign over copyright. Be very careful when you do it. The thing that I would say is most important is if you're going to have copyright assignment, if contributors are going to assign copyright to you because your lawyers are making you do it that way, treat it as a social contract. Treat it as we need to do, as a company, we need to do right by this. Now the problem is you can be bought by a company, you can be bought by Oracle, and Oracle doesn't know how to do right or wrong because they're sociopaths. So you know, be mindful of the fact that your company doesn't actually know how to, that it may be bought by an entity that doesn't know how to do right or wrong. And also be aware that you're going to get an asymmetry in the community. There's going to be one entity that holds copyright and other people don't. So be very careful about that. In terms of learning from these anti-patterns, don't treat these as hard and fast rules. Your local conditions may vary. You may be in areas where it's very appropriate to have copyright assignment or to use the GPL-v2 or what have you. But just be aware of these are our experiences and where we failed as Open Solaris. In the Illumos community, we are very mindful of these anti-patterns. And some things like copyright assignment we don't have in Illumos because of that. At Joyent, speaking for Joyent, Joyent has a number of open source projects of which we are the steward, in particular Node.js. Hopefully folks have heard of Node. I've got a talk tomorrow on Node at 10 in the morning, which is like the even earlier time slot tomorrow, and SmartOS. So we try to be very mindful of these anti-patterns. Open source is absolutely essential to our business. Not just as a consumer, but also as a contributor and as an innovator. And we're making mistakes. I know we're making mistakes. I'm sure, hopefully they are new mistakes. And I would say that my Fizzly talk in 2022, let's block that one off, and I'll talk about all the mistakes I'm making now, because I just don't know what the mistakes are yet. And right now I don't think they're mistakes, but in 2022 it'll be obvious. And with that, I will open it up briefly for questions. Any questions? Yes?
Do I just speak up or do I get a microphone?
But I think we've got the room until 12.
Hi.
Yes.
First, thank you for a great talk. Second, I'm going to be talking to HP managers at the end of the month about what not to do. Do you have any suggestions specific to that particular company?
Yeah, other than to print certain slides out on a very heavy medium and kind of pocket at them. Yeah, I mean, I think that actually HP is a great example of the kind of entity that I think could benefit from what we have learned. Because HP at its core, I still believe, maybe this is just the naive Silicon Valley kind of do-eyed young boy, but I still believe that HP is a good company. And HP wants to do the right thing. So I think that HP would benefit from a lot of this stuff. And I would want to share all of these learnings with HP. Starting with when you open source something, please make the source code available. So yeah, hopefully I would recommend sharing the entire document actually.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, other questions? Yes. JB.
Hi. I have one remark and one question. The remark about what you said on copyright assignment is, I agree, except we have had the issue is when you need to license to a more, to a better or more liberal license, how do you do when people are dead? That was very difficult for two people, so some projects have started to do something which is, you don't do a copyright assignment, but when you die, you give. Kelly did that, for example. So that was just a remark. But I had a question. Did you look at what Qt Project did and how they split from Nokia, who is a specialist of those anti-patterns?
No, I would love to hear more details. I did not like what they did. Just to your first point, I absolutely agree. And the peril of not having copyright assignment is you are essentially sedimenting the license forever. The license may never change. And because you just need to assume that people are going to die, or they're going to disagree with you, or what have you. It's a very important point. As to the second point, no, I would love to hear the details. I don't know the details.
Because that's interesting. They did a bit the Anti-Python Foundation, which is they separate themselves from Nokia, knowing that Nokia was going to do some stupid stuff that they did, in fact. But they did not push the couch. They recreated a Qt project and a new government, and it took them something like 1 year and a half. And so far, it's good. Nokia is dying, but Qt is going to split up again. So.
Yeah, that's great. No, we didn't look at that as a model. That obviously post-dated us, but yeah, that's terrific. Sorry, I know we need to give up the room here, so one more question maybe? If not, there's probably a gang of GPLv2 thugs waiting for me in the hallway to beat me senseless, so I'll just get on with being beat up. Super, thank you very much for your time.